Hello and welcome to this new blog post on sales text in Dynamics 365. In today's blog post, I would like to have a look at the sales text app and the configuration that we can do with the new sales text service. Once we have talked about and investigated the setup, I would like to show you some transactions and how you can record them in the system. And then we do a reconciliation and have a look at the reporting and submission of the text statements before we close with a summary. So let's start with the setup first. So if you want to get started with the new sales text service, there are a couple of things that you need to set up before it works. And the first thing that you have to be aware of is that you need a tier 2 environment. Whether you have such an environment or not can be checked easily through this website that I added you here in the form of a web link. Yeah? So just check it out. Then the other thing is, in lifecycle services, you have to make sure that the environment add-in for the text calculation is available and enabled. And once that is done, you have to go to Dynamics 365 and make sure that a couple of features are enabled. Today we will have a look at the calculation service. So this one should be enabled. We will check out multiple VAT registration numbers. And maybe in a later post we will have a look at text in transfer orders. So these features should be enabled at a minimum. And then on the right hand side you see a parameter setting, enable text calculation service. This one must be enabled if you want to use the new text calculation service over the previously used standard text calculation in Dynamics, as we know it from the previous system. So if you work with AX4, AX2009 and so on, then you might know how the text calculation works. If you do not want to use it and want to use the new service, make sure this parameter is enabled. Okay, and then I switch a bit. So if we have a look at the slides that I will show you, then a blue color always means the configuration needs to be done in Dynamics 365. If there's a red color, then we talk about the regulatory configuration service. And this is something that you need to set up and configure. And to open this configuration website, you need to navigate to electronic reporting. In the workspace, you can find here this link to RCS, and you need to open it, sign in, and then enable another feature. And this is specific for this configuration service, and the feature is called globalization features. So I highlighted you that one here. Okay, so once that is finished, then we have the first part of the setup done. And now we need to talk about VAT registrations. Why is that? Well, because we might have multiple VAT registrations and want to submit text statements not only for the country in which we operate, mainly our business operations, but also maybe for other countries where we have other text registrations. And in the following, we have a look at these text registrations and how to set them up. So first of all, we need to navigate to Organization Administration. And in this module, you will find a text registration type form. And in this form, you can set up the text registrations that you have. So you have here an example for Germany, where I set up here the text registration for this country and region. And then we have Austria, Belgium, France, and whatever we need. And this is not only for the company, but also for customers or vendors. So make sure that you set them up for all of the countries, regions you need. And then there's something you need to be very careful with when it comes to setting up these parameters. And I highlighted this in the next slide. So if you have a VAT ID, so such as this one for Germany, and you want to use it for multiple addresses in the same country. So let's say you have a vendor, Siemens, Germany, and you have an address in Hamburg and in Munich. And if they share the same VET ID, you have to make sure that this one is disabled, because otherwise you can set up the VET ID only for the primary address in the country. The second parameter is also an important one, because it basically says whether the VET ID that you configure is one that is unique or one that you can reuse. So if we continue the example where we say, okay, the VET ID for Hamburg and Munich is the same. Yeah. If you enable this parameter, then you cannot make this setup. So for this specific example, you would have to disable it. So please take a very close look at how this registration type setup is working and what you need to configure here. Once you have the registration type configured, then we need to link it to a registration category. In our case, it's just VET ID. And here you can see that I have set up for Netherlands, Belgium, Germany, and the other countries that you need. And with this setup, we can then open our legal entity. So here in my case, I'm in Cardoso DEMF, and there is a registration ID button that opens this form. And in this form, you just enter all of the registration numbers that you have. So here is Germany. You have here this tax registration number. Then we have Amsterdam. Maybe you have an office there or a warehouse or something. Then you have this registration number. And for Belgium, you have this one. And of course, there's also something special here. And what makes it special is this number sequence. So imagine you have different tax registration numbers and you want to identify, well, was an invoice recorded with the German or with the, let's say, Belgium tax registration ID. If you want to have this separation, then you can set up number sequence groups for each of these addresses that you basically have. Then the next thing is the setup of the tax authorities and settlement periods. And here the same principle applies. So on the left hand side, you see the tax authorities. I have here Germany, then Belgium, Netherlands, and you just enter this tax registration ID, and the same for the settlement periods where you need to select them. And once you're finished with the company setup, you can do the same for your customers and vendors. And the idea is the same. So you have here a tax registration ID form. And if a customer, like here Siemens, has multiple addresses, you can just enter their VET ID number for each of the addresses. And of course, the same applies to customers. So pretty easy. And this is the example that I set up. So I have a single vendor that I call Siemens, and Siemens has different addresses, one in Munich, a second one in Munich, in the UK, in Italy. And for the addresses, we either have a tax registration number, we don't have one, or we have a country that was part of the European Union but left and still has the old ID number. And all of this has an impact on how we deal with the value-added tax. In the middle, we have our company. So we have tax registrations in Germany, Netherlands, and Belgium. And on the right-hand side, we have a customer that has 2 offices, let's say in France. And for one, it has a VET ID number, for the other one not. And in Switzerland, it has something, and in Germany. And that's what we will use in the following for the basic examples that I will show you in this post. Okay, but before we come to the examples, let me quickly go through this setup to give you an idea where you can find all of that and how you have to set it up. Okay, so we are here in my demo machine, and I did this setup in my German company. So let's quickly switch to DMF because we're dealing with value-added tax. And first thing that I want to show you is in the tax configuration or in the tax module, there is this calculation parameters. And that's the parameter that I talk about. Later we will see something about this feature management and business processes. but for the beginning it's important that this parameter is enabled. Otherwise some of the forms and fields are not available. So the other thing is here in organization administration, where you can find here the registration types. That's the very important form. I had a couple of problems because I did not know before what these parameters here are doing. So be careful whether you enable or disable them. And once you have these registration types set up, then the next thing is here the registration categories. And here, if you open it, you will find a field or a couple of predefined fields. We need VET ID and later enterprise ID for the tax report to show the enterprise ID number. And here just make sure that you set up all of the countries and regions for which you want to record VET IDs. And then of course, here in the legal entity and for the customer and vendors is really the same. You have to make sure that you have different addresses set up. And so I have here Germany, I have Belgium, Netherlands, and then here in the registration ID, that's where you enter these numbers. Same here for Netherlands and then Belgium. So that's the crucial thing. And of course, here, if you like, you can set up separate number sequence groups to differentiate, for example, packing slip and invoice vouchers that you want to later on use for reconciliation. Okay, so that's the basic setup. If you want to know where to find this RCS, then you go to electronic reporting, and here at the very bottom you see here the regulatory configuration service. You sign up the first time, so I did that already, so I sign in here, and once this is done, you should see a new website. And the first time you open this feature might be not available. So make sure you have enabled it here through feature management. And then the rest here in electronic reporting and also in system administration looks familiar to what we know from Dynamics 365. But before I show you here details, let's go back to my PowerPoint and have a look at what needs to be configured here and in other parts of Dynamics. Okay, so the next thing is the sales tax setup, and here we need to do that in RCS. So I highlighted this one in red, just to make sure that you know where we are. And the first thing is in the electronic reporting, you need to set up a provider, same way as you do it in Dynamics 365. And once you have that, you open it, this global repository, and import here this text data model. That's needed so that we can do the configuration later on. Okay, then in the globalization features, we have the text calculation. And then what you need to do, and I will show you also that in a minute, is you create here a new name. Then it creates a draft version, and then you click on edit. And then you see here the text calculation form where you need to make the setup. But if you do it the first time, you might see these error messages. They look like error messages, but actually are just warnings, what I learned or heard. And that is because here there are a couple of fields like the source legal entity and here maybe the country region that are not linked to what we have in F&O. So if you open the drop-down will be blank. So then the question is, how can we fill that? How do we get these drop-downs available from the things that we set up and configured in Dynamics 365? And the answer is you need to set up the master data lookup. If you want to enable it, here is a link to Microsoft Docs website. But we will quickly go through that. So first thing is in Lifecycle Services, you have to make sure that you have a Power Platform environment linked to your tier 2 machine or higher machine. Once that is done, you need to set up virtual entities. Yeah? There's a blog post here from, I think it's from Rachel Profit, one of the former MVPs, now working for Microsoft, and she provided a pretty good description here how to configure that. And the minimum virtual entities that you need to set up are listed here. I configured a couple more for other purposes, but this is what you can find on Microsoft Docs. Then the next thing is in the feature management, and that's in RCS. It's not in Dynamics 365. You have to make sure that you have this feature enabled. And in electronic reporting, you need then to establish a connection between RCS and Dataverse. Yeah? Because we are working with virtual entities, so everything from Dynamics 365 is then available in Dataverse. And now, if we want to have the lookup in RCS, we need to establish the link RCS to Dataverse. And that's done via this configuration window. Here you enter the application, and here in the custom URL, just add this API data version 9.1. That's described on this website that I shared before. And once this is done, you go to text configurations, and the Dataverse model mapping needs then to be linked to this connected application, and this parameter enabled. And once that is done, you have the drop downs available. Yeah. So here's a screenshot how it looks like. Okay. So then let's have a look at the sample setup that I made. Yeah. And as I said, we have a single vendor that we use, Siemens, and I want to differentiate 3 simple cases. Yeah. First one is we buy from Siemens Germany. So DMF is DE is for Deutschland or Germany. They buy from a German vendor. Very easy. Then the next one is UK. UK is no longer part of the European Union. So that's a purchase from a third country or a non-European Union country. And then we have Italy. Italy is part of the European Union. So that's reverse charge European purchase. Yeah, I listed you here the different cases and the tax codes that I used. Yeah? And TS stands for tax service. It's just to differentiate the new codes that I set up from the old ones that were already in this demo version. Then I have D for Deutschland or Germany. In means incoming, out later means outgoing invoice or tax rate. Then we have VAT, and full means full. So 19% in Germany, 0 means of course tax-free. And then we have here the European Union and the offset tax rates. Now that's what we need. If we look or put this in the form of a tax matrix, yeah, then we have here tax service D for Deutschland. Yeah. In a later post I will try to use this for Belgium and the Netherlands. Yeah. And then we have AP DOM for domestic vendors, EU and third country vendors. And in my case I just have the full tax rate applied. Yeah. And all of these tax codes, they are assigned to the full tax rate. Yeah. It's not really necessary with the new tax service. So here you have really more freedom how you can do that. And I will explain this a bit later in more detail. But that's the setup that I used. I want to keep it basically very simple. And then we have a look at the sales. So here's our company. And then we sell products to Volkswagen Deutschland, to France and to Switzerland. Yeah, that's domestic country, that's European Union, and that's outside European Union. And here are the tax codes that I use. Yeah, which is basically similar to what you find in the standard Contoso demo companies. Yeah? So I just use a different naming convention for the tax codes, but the principle is the same. Yeah? Also here, the tax matrix that I used, also pretty easy. And now let us have a look at how I configured that in Dynamics 365 or RCS in this case. Okay, so let us have a quick look at RCS and what I configured here. So maybe we start with electronic reporting. And if you open this tile, you see here text configurations. And in this text configuration is this data model that I downloaded. And here you see the link to this Dataverse, the connected application. So if we click on that, then you see here the string that I used. Okay, then the other thing is this globalization feature. That's the important piece here, because inside of this you have the text configuration. So we have here text calculation. Then I have this one here is just a name, and then you see that you have published versions that are few only, and then draft versions. So if a text rate, let's say, changes, you would create a new version. So just click on new once this is available. So if the last one is published, this becomes available, and then you can click on edit. And with this master data lookup, you then have the possibility to filter here. So you see here the companies, because it's a virtual entity. If you look at specific things here, let's say this text group applicability, here I have vendors that I can look up. I have countries, regions that I can look up. And this is all made out of the box. But for the beginning, you need three things. So first, you need text groups. That's mandatory. These are the text groups that I used, and if you just ignore the first three letters, then you will find something that is similar to what you are used to from the standard Contoso demo companies. So we have AP-DOM, AP-EU, AP-CERT, and then the same for receivables, domestic, European Union, and CERT. And of course, you have more freedom how to set this up compared to the old text model, but I wanted to keep it simple here. So here's the text group. The text codes are set up here. It's also similar. So we have, let's say here, this is the text for the incoming transactions with the full text rate. So you enter here basically a date range, and then here the text rate. Then I have here something for EU purchases. So it's incoming. And then you also set up the text rate here. And for the offset, you say, okay, it's reverse charge, and then use a negative text rate. And if you have that, okay, then you can link these text codes to these text groups. And then also to the item text groups. And here I just use a single item text group. I said is the full text group where I assigned all of the text codes. Okay, before we come to this applicability forms in more detail, and this one here, I would like to go back to my PowerPoint and try to explain you a couple of additional things that are important to understand how this configuration works. So let's go back. Okay, so let us have a look now at a sales transaction first, because they are kind of easier to go through. So on the right hand side, you see the text matrix that I used for accounts receivable, domestic, EU, and third countries. And the determination of whether this is a domestic, EU, or non-EU sale is basically made in the text group applicability form based on the business process. So in this case, it's a sale, and the country and region type. So these two fields in combination define what text group will be applied. Then when it comes to the item text group, well, I just have here a configuration made that says for purchases and sales, always use this full text rate. And the combination of these two gives us then the correct text code that will be applied. Now, how does it determine the text code that will be used? And that's something that you can find on this Microsoft Docs website. Well, basically for sales orders, it looks at the delivery address of the country and region if you make use of the ship to country region field. Yeah, there are a couple of other fields and the configurations that can be made, so please check out this website. Yeah, but I said, okay, if we have a shipment to a specific country, then it looks at this delivery address, then the country region. So in my example, it looks to France. And then from the foreign trade parameters, it knows that France, this country, is part of the European Union. And because of that, it applies this tax code. Now, if we have a look at the purchase transactions, then things get a bit more complex. Yeah? But let's first start with the easy one. So the full item tax group is applied to purchases and sales in my example, to all transactions. That's easy. But when it comes to separating domestic European Union and non-European purchases, then there are a couple of problems. Why is that? Well, first problem is the way how the sales tax codes are identified. It's basically the delivery address or the primary address for purchase orders. So if you have a look at my vendor Siemens, then I have different addresses for Germany. I have different countries in the European Union and outside the European Union, and only one of those can be the default delivery or primary address. So that's a problem. The other problem is that the tax ID, which identifies whether you have a tax registration in Germany, Italy, France, Belgium, wherever, that this field is not part of the determination of the tax in the new tax service. The product team is working on that, but at the time of recording this video, it's not part of that. And that's one of the biggest problems that I currently see. So if you try to set up here the vendor tax registration number for one single vendor, and if you try to set up the German and Italian and other tax IDs, then you will see this yellow line, but it's actually not a warning, it's an error message, because it does not leave you out of this tax calculation form and publish it. So what you have to do is you have to use workarounds. And the first workaround that I found is, okay, let's use invoice accounts or separate vendor accounts that we set up for this purpose. So the advantage would be that the tax setup can be done in RCS. But the disadvantage of this approach is that you need to set up multiple vendor accounts or invoice accounts, and that analyzing them and the transactions becomes more complex. So here's an example where I set up for Siemens. So that's my vendor Siemens. I set up a separate invoice account, Siemens Italy, in Rome in this case, and to this vendor I linked then my Italian tax ID. And then if you have this, you can go to the tax group applicability, say, okay, here are purchases. So if I purchase from this vendor, it's the German one, then I use the domestic tax group. That's the Italian, then I use the European Union tax group, and otherwise the one for non-European purchases. The other alternative is you can manually override the tax calculation. So there's a parameter for that, which you can enable and then change the tax group and the item tax group that the tax service identifies. And the advantage of that is, of course, you do not need to set up additional vendor accounts, but you need to train your people to look out for that. And the process is then not fully automated, and there's a higher risk of errors. And the third workaround would be to extend the tax configuration, but this requires with development or low-code development electronic reporting skills. That costs, of course, a bit of money, time and money, but the advantage would be to fully automate this process. So what I'm hoping for is that the product team completes this shortcoming that we have at the moment, so that we do not need to make use of these workarounds. Okay, so once we have set up all of these tax calculation features in RCS, The next step would be then to change the version to published, because if it's published, it becomes available for selection in Dynamics 365. So if you go back to Dynamics 365 after you published your text setup in RCS, you will be able to select here in the drop down all of the published versions. And if you do it the first time, automatically such a window will pop up that shows you the new text codes that you set up, and it asks you to fill the settlement period and the ledger posting group. And I configured it here, and once that is done and you click OK, what happens is that you will see the sales text codes. In the sales text codes form, you will see these new text codes that are imported from the text service, and this is something you can identify based on the source. In the sales text groups in Dynamics, you can also see the new sales text groups from the text service that have been set up, and the same applies to the item sales text groups. An important thing here is that you need to make sure that you select the correct reporting type. This does not come from RCS. You have to select it manually to make sure that the European sales list is configured correctly and gives you the right output. Okay, so that's it for the setup. And then let us have a look at the transactions. So what I will do in the following is I will go through purchases, a couple of purchases or purchase orders. And then I will go through sales or sales orders in Dynamics. So let's switch systems here and move away from my PowerPoint to my Dynamics 365 application. Okay, so before we jump into the different examples that I prepared, let's go through this text calculation functionality first in RCS. So here I selected basically the calculation version that I downloaded from the global repository. Then we have here the text codes, and here is just the setup is very, very similar to what you are used to from Dynamics 365 F&O. Just make sure that you do not enter more than 10 digits here for the text codes, otherwise you cannot import them. And then here for the European Union, the tax rate is in Germany 19%. For the reverse charge offsets, it's minus 19%. And then for other purchases, this might be 0 or 19, the full tax rate. And here we have the outgoing tax rates. To European Union is tax-free. To German sales, we have a tax rate of 19%, and to non-European countries, we have again 0%. Then we had a look at the text group and item text groups again. And here is the text group applicability, and that's the workaround basically that I use, because the text registration that you see here that can be selected from the manage column form. So I selected this. It is not considering the text registration for the different countries and regions that we have. So be aware of that. And then of course, this is something here, list code applicability. If you need to report European Union sales tax list, you can also set up identification of the different transactions based on the country or region where you ship things to. And here, if I ship to European Union countries, I say then put the list code to European Union trade or something else. So let's open it. And then you do not need to take care of that in the sales order. But now let's actually have a look at the sales order. So let's start here. And in accounts receivable, we have here our sales orders. And if I create a new one, and we will do this for the customer Volkswagen, so I say DE777. So if we have the shipping address here to Germany, then I select the warehouse here. That's it, basically what we set up, nothing else. Then we say OK. And And now we select our item. Yeah, there's also nothing special here. It's one of the default items with this price. But if you scroll down in the setup section, you will see that I did not set up a sales text group for my customer. I just did not make the setup. Why? Well, because the text service does not need that to identify the text that is applied. So let me show you that. So if we click on cell and here sales text, then a call will be made to the text service, and it will identify this text code, which is an outgoing text, is correct, and for the full rate. Here you can see the customer and the company text registration numbers. And in case you do not like this identification, you can always come here and say, okay, I think it is maybe an European Union sale. So you have the possibility to override that. And if you do that, so let's say, okay, that's a European Union sale. So let's save it. And then if we click on sales text, we see now that's a tax-free sale. Whether it makes sense or not is a different thing, but you have the possibility to override these things. Okay, now let us create a new one. And now select the same vendor, customer, sorry. But now I want to have a different delivery address. So here we select one of the other addresses that we have. So here the resolution is not the best probably, because make it big. Let's say we have the shipment to Volkswagen France. We say okay, so here is our French address. Again, we select the site and warehouse. And that's it. So again now, if we enter our item, we see again, that's not filled yet. If we click on the sales text, then you can see it's the outgoing sales text for EU. It's tax-free. But there's one important issue here, and that's the tax registration number. It's still a German one. And why is that? Well, because it takes the one from the default setup. So let us switch that, and switch it to the correct French one, because if you have EU sales, you need to make sure you use the French VAT ID number. Otherwise, it's cannot be treated as a EU sale. So now it's correct. So this is also a shortcoming that I currently see, that we need to manually make this update. And of course, if you would sell this product to Switzerland or the US, then a different tax rate would apply. Okay, now let's move to accounts payable, and let's try the same. So we have here purchase order, and we have here our vendor account 1, 2, 3. That is Siemens. So if we purchase something from Siemens Germany, and say okay, deliver it to this site and warehouse, then we have here the tax exempt number, and then again we select the item, and here again you see that also the vendor is not set up with a sales tax group. That's not really needed. Why? Because we have the tax service that is doing the identification for us. Also the item have a setup of this full tax group, which is a tax group that we did not configure in RCS. But if we click on sales tax, then it should find the full tax rate for Germany, and TS basically shows you that this is really coming from tax service. And here we have the tax registration numbers. So this works fine. But now I do not have here a possibility to say, okay, the delivery of Siemens is actually not coming from Germany, but from another address. So I cannot just come here and say, okay, I switch here the text number to Italy, save it, and then my expectation would be that the sales tax is then calculated for reverse charge, but it's not, and that's a shortcoming that I explained you. So to overcome this shortcoming, so let us create a new purchase order. Then we have here same Siemens, but now I'm using here my Italian invoice account, which I set up in the tax matrix in RCS. So if you go back to RCS, then we have here the tax group applicability, and we are in this line where I say in the header the invoice account determines which tax group is used, and that's exactly what I'm doing here. I say deliver to this site and warehouse, and then of course I should switch or update this tax exempt number, and then say OK. And again, if I enter this item, click on sales tax, then the calculation should now be different. This here is also shortcoming, that when the tax registration number is not automatically switching, even though I selected this one, it still takes the one from the vendor account. So be aware of that it's not perfectly working with the VAT ID numbers, especially from a purchase side. Okay, but that's basically what I want to show you and highlight you, that you have to be careful, especially when it comes to purchases and the VAT ID identification. Now let us go back to my PowerPoint to see how we can reconcile and report on sales tax with the help of Dynamics and this new tax service that we have available. Okay, so we are here at the reconciliation and reporting part. And the first thing that I want to show you is the European Union sales list. To make use of that, you have to make sure that the list codes are set up correctly, and that's also done in RCS. Then the next thing is you have to import the EU sales list electronic report in Dynamics 365. And once that is done, in the foreign trade parameters, you select this file format mapping, and then you select either to create the report by rows or by columns. And I will show you the difference in a minute. The other important thing is that you need to set up your country and region properties. So to let Dynamics know whether this is a European Union country or not. And then you have a couple of reconciliation reports. These are standard reports that were available also in the previous Dynamics versions. But what I really prefer and like is the possibility to use the group by functionality. So here I opened the posted sales tax form, filtered my transactions, and then I said group by this tax code here. And this gives you then the chance, okay, you know, okay, this is the outgoing VAT for European Union. So you know, okay, this one must show up here in my EU sales tax list. And that's something very, very helpful when it comes to reconciling. The EU sales list itself is then, well, or running the report is the same as in the previous versions, basically. So you select a from date, and then you define a file name and a report file name, and then you generate the report. It gives you an Excel file and a text file, and based on whether you selected or you made a selection by rows, you see either here the item, triangulate rate and service transactions here in different rows, or you see it in columns if you made the other selection in the parameters. But the text file is always the same. Now when it comes to the VAT report for Germany, then you need to set up the enterprise ID first. And if you remember from the beginning, the registration types that we set up, we also need to set it up for the enterprise ID and then link it with this registration category. Yeah? That's important because this number is then shown on top of the sales tax report. Yeah? And to make sure that it's shown, you have to set it up for the country or region address for which you want to run the report. Yeah, in my case, it's Germany. Okay, then there's a good news, and the good news is that in the sales tax codes, you don't need to set up these numbers, which was always a hassle and people did not know. Well, the bad news is that you still have to do it, but now in a different way. It's basically an electronic reporting. So if you look for the VAT declaration for Germany, for example, there's here a setup, and this setup helps you to map the tax codes to the different lines in your tax statement or in your tax report. So it's a different way, but I find it's a bit easier because it's not so much where you have to think, okay, which field needs to be filled and not. The other thing before you can run the tax report is you have to link this report configuration in the general ledger parameters, and then you have a couple of reconciliation reports that you should use before you run the VAT report, or alternatively use what I showed you before, this group by functionality. And then you can create and report the sales tax for the settlement report, and then you can post it. So the first one just gives you a report. The second one also creates the vouchers and clears the VAT accounts. So here the setup and how you run it is very similar to previous Dynamics versions. What we have here in a special way is a special advance payment. So some companies in Germany have the right to submit their VAT statements basically 2 months later. Usually we do it in the following months, but if you make a special payment, then you get an extension of an additional month. But to do that, to get this extension, you have to pay an amount upfront. And this upfront payment can also be considered in the VAT report just by entering the amount here. Okay, and then you get a sales tax report. Here's an Excel form. Excel and XML are supported, and XML is the file format that you have to submit to the tax authority. If you need any other Word document or something, then you can configure that yourself in electronic reporting. Okay, so this basically is everything I wanted to share with you. Let's quickly have a look at the summary that I have. And first I would like to start with the advantages that I see from the new tax service compared to the old tax configuration. And the first advantage that I see is the ability to set up all of your taxes from a single centralized location. So the maintenance is becoming a bit easier, and it has the ability to scale. So if you have really mass transactions, thousands of invoices every day, then the tax service is the way to go. What you do not need really is separate ledger posting groups and ledger accounts for tax postings. So many Germans like to have separate ledger accounts for each tax code. But with the reconciliation and grouping functionalities that I showed you, that's not really necessary. I mean, many German accountants still prefer that, but it's not mandatory to have that. And then, of course, what we also have is we can use these functionalities for tax group reporting. So if you have a couple of companies that have to submit a consolidated VAT report, we can do that either with ledger postings or without. If you do not need vouchers, then you can follow what is described here on Microsoft Docs. It's basically just consolidating different VAT declarations. If you also need vouchers and intercompany transactions between them, because the one that makes the statement and submits it to the tax authority has a receivable against the other companies for which you handle that, then have a look at one of my previous posts where I describe how this works. Now let's come to the limitations and the workarounds that I used, and the first one is actually the most important one, and this is the text registration ID, which is not used in the text calculation, and this makes it very difficult to implement something like triangular trade between different countries and regions in Europe, because you would have to find workarounds for that. So as I said, the product team is working on that, but at the time of recording this video it was not available. Then the setup is rather complex. You saw the registration types and the setups that are made in Dynamics, in RCS, in the electronic workspace is something that needs a while. And also don't forget that you need to set up these virtual entities and the Dataverse connection. So it's quite something that you need to set up. Then the other thing is, I mentioned that we can create European Union sales list reports and the VAT statements for Germany. That's all nice, but the transfer to the tax authority is not supported out of the box yet. So you have to do that either with the help of Power Platform or do it manually. And annual VAT statements are also not supported yet. Yeah. Okay, but that's it basically what I wanted to share with you. It was quite lengthy blog post, but I want to have it complete so that you get an idea from A to Z. For a very basic example, what are the things you need to set up, what you need to look out for, and what are the current limitations. So I hope you enjoyed it, watching and listening. And as usual, if you have comment or remarks, put it in the comment sections or send me an email. So thanks a lot, and then looking forward to seeing you also in the next blog posts.